She walked up to the grimy metal door with a bruise hard and dark on her cheek, hoodie pulled up like a poor shield, and spoke 2 words that stopped the room. "Can I work here?" The question landed in the biker clubhouse like a small, impossible thing. Engines hummed in the background. A radio flicked off. A half-dozen men looked up from a table of greasy parts and stale coffee, and for a moment the place held its breath. They had seen street kids before, hustlers and runaways, kids looking for cash or a warm handout. They had not seen a child who refused pity and asked for a job. Not like that. Nora Collins was 13, though she looked smaller with sleeves several sizes too long and sneakers held together by strips of silver duct tape that crinkled when she stepped. The bruise on her left cheek throbbed under the slate light, a purple bloom that contrasted with the stubborn set of her jaw. She did not look like someone who wanted sympathy. She looked like someone who knew how to survive and wanted to do it on her own terms. Keller, the man who kept the books and the peace and the unspoken rules of the clubhouse, watched her for a long beat. He had the broad shoulders and the slow, certain voice of someone used to being the last stop for problems that had nowhere else to go. Around him, jokes and muffled laughter bubbled up, some cruel, some curious. People tested each other that way. Nora did not flinch. "Can I work here?" she repeated, voice steady and low, as if asking the simplest favor in the world. The room tasted like oil and old metal and a faint sweetness of fried grease from the diner across the street. A smell that had comfort for them, foreign and raw to the child standing in their doorway. Keller's eyes moved from the bruise to the shoes, to the way the hoodie hung around her frame. He noticed the small things, the calluses on hands that shouldn't have any, the quickness that came from needing to be alert. There was a clarity there that looked almost like a dare. "Work?" someone snorted. "What can you do, kid? Hold a coffee? Fetch rags?" Nora looked back at the speaker and let the quiet answer. She unzipped the hoodie a fraction, revealing a flannel shirt under the hood. "I can sweep," she said. "I can hand you bolts. I can listen. I'm fast." It was the kind of answer that was less about promise and more about muscle memory, of jobs learned by watching, of staying useful so no one had to look too hard. The room softened, a fraction. Mockery gave way to the practical. If she stayed, they might still worry. Keller leaned forward, elbows on knees. He liked tests. He liked to see if people would meet a single standard: honesty about what they were, and steady work for what they wanted. "You show up," he said. "You don't steal. You don't lie. You tell the truth about where you come from. You do the work. We don't do welfare. We do chances. You take a chance." Nora nodded once. She had nothing to lose and everything to prove. She handed over a fixed, adult thing in the smallness of her gesture, a willingness to be accountable. It was, to them, the most dignified request imaginable. "All right," Keller said, and there was a click in the room like a decision being made. "If you value second chances, share this." They put her to work right away, not because they wanted to adopt a kid, and not because the clubhouse felt noble. They put Nora to work because work was what they knew how to offer: practical, immediate, often gritty. Lucky, a mechanic with grease under his nails and kindness in his eyes, handed her a broom and showed her the rhythm of the garage floor. Sweep from the center, keep your shoulders square, don't try to pick up the heavy axle alone. He taught her how to carry a tray of parts without clanging. He trained her to sort bolts and washers into their tiny, precise places. She learned to read the scrawl on oil-stained schematics like a foreign script translated into muscle memory. She became part of the machine by doing work that fit her size. The clubhouse became a slow, careful refuge. Lunches appeared. Not charity meals, but sandwiches slid across a table as someone finished their own. A cup of coffee left within reach. A thermos set down where she could find it. Tina, from the diner across the street, started leaving a small brown paper bag on the porch some nights when she noticed Nora wiping down tables after dark. "Eat, kid," Tina said once. "Don't be a hero to your stomach." Moose Joe, who had ridden longer than his joints liked to remember, found her a small old toolbox and scrawled her name on it in a sloppy hand. He showed up early some mornings to help her sweep and told her stories about machines and mistakes and how parts can teach you patience if you listen. The men watched her with a protectiveness that was rough around the edges. They teased, they tested, but they also began to keep an eye for bruises that showed up a little too often, for the hesitation in her voice when someone mentioned home, for the way she flinched if a door slammed too hard. It did not take them long to see a pattern. Small accidents, she said. Clumsy, she said. Until the bruises became frequent enough that Lucky started keeping a simple log. Dates, visible marks, a note that said Nora. He did it with a pen he kept between his fingers like a nervous habit, and he slipped those notes into an envelope labeled "Do Not Lose" and gave it to Keller. Keller took photos sometimes, quick and evidence-like, with a spare camera from an old case. They knew they were not policemen or social workers. They were people who could make a path into the light if someone guided them. They had to do it carefully. There was a photo that Tina found tucked in an old filing drawer at the diner, a Polaroid with corners long turned and a woman's smile faded into the film. It showed Nora once, younger, a piece of ribbon in her hair, a different house in the background. There was a date, half obscured by a coffee ring. The last time she might have been with someone who called herself Mom. After that, records grew thin. Measures of child support were inconsistent. A phone number didn't take calls. The mother, the records suggested, had been absent for a while in ways that needed asking about. So they began to ask, quietly, without spectacle. Tanner, who managed the bookings and had a way with forms, called Melina at Child Protective Services after hearing the tea-splashed secrets at the diner phase. Melina came through with caution. Agencies like hers moved slow by design and force of bureaucracy, designed to keep things true in court and to keep children safe with proper due process. She listened to Keller and Lucky and Moose Joe, took in the photos, made notes about the Polaroid, and scheduled a formal welfare check. The first time the foster parent, Clive Henderson, showed up at the clubhouse, there was no shouting. His walk had a practiced menace, the kind that suggested he had been loud before and found it didn't always get him what he wanted. He was broad-shouldered, middle-aged, a smell of stale cologne and something like anger trailing him. He asked for Nora in a voice that was half demand, half curiosity. He wanted to know why his foster child was on the property of strangers who kept their own rules. Keller met him with the slow calculation that had kept this place standing for years. He did not threaten. He did not step forward. He stood at a respectful distance and asked questions in that even voice that made a man like Clive uncomfortable, because it suggested there were eyes measuring him that would not waver. Clive shoved his hands in his pockets. He wanted the upper hand. "She's in my care," Clive said. "She needs to come home." "She asked for work," Keller replied. "She told us the rules. We ask, she keeps them. That's all." Clive's jaw tightened. "You let her wander off," he said. "You harder kids. That's not how this works." "It works the way it works," Keller said. "We give chances to people who ask for them." Clive's face reddened. There was a tension then that could have gone ugly, a shove, an accusation, something that might have crossed a line. But Barker, who had a knack for moving when a situation needed dampening, stepped between them with a simple, practical hand on Clive's shoulder. "We can do this the clean way," he said, voice low. "You want your kid back? We call Melina. We get it on the record. You want to do anything else? We don't let that happen." Clive did not like that. He turned, left with his hands empty, and the kind of walk that meant trouble might come back later. The bikers did not follow. They did not need to. Their presence alone had held him at bay.
By then, Nora had been with them for weeks, learning to change oil filters with Lucky's patient instruction and sweeping the garage like a metronome. She had a steady place to sleep in a converted corner upstairs, a cot tucked against a wall with a blanket that smelt faintly of bleach and engine grease. They had made room for her with the kind of speed that comes from a small community breathing in a single rhythm. No one pretended the clubhouse was home like a house with white picket fences. But it was a place where someone could be housed with dignity, given food that felt like a meal, and given work that kept the nights from swallowing restlessness. Nora kept her own small rituals. She labeled her tools. She wrote a to-do list in a spiral-bound notebook. Sweep, sort spark plugs, call Melina. The last one a line always crossed out because she seemed afraid to call the woman who kept asking about her. On slow nights, Moose Joe would sit with her on the back steps and talk about stars through cigarette smoke and the little ways to keep a bike running in the cold. "You don't have to fix someone to be worth fixing," he would say. And she would not always answer because some truths were for listening, not answering. The more they watched her, the more oddities they noticed. The bruises faded and reappeared. Nora moved through the day with a careful economy. Never too loud, never too trusting. When Clive came back the second time, the group was ready. He stood at the threshold and demanded to know why Nora had not returned to the house he named as home. He used the word like a weapon, home, as though it would hold weight against the facts. "I said you come when I call," he said. "You do what you're told." Nora looked at him for the first time, and, in a voice that did not tremble, told him that she didn't want to go back. "You hurt me," she said, simply. "I don't want to be hurt." No one in that room offered a judgmental look. They reacted like people who had seen harm before and recognized the face of survival in her words. Clive's face got harder. "You don't talk that way," he barked. "You're mine to control." Lucky moved, not with fists, but with paper. He slid a Polaroid across the table that he had taken of a bruise on her arm a week prior. He had kept receipts, medical notes where a nurse had commented on healed marks, and a dated photograph of the Polaroid from Tina's diner that suggested larger inconsistencies in Nora's history. He had texted a few hesitant messages to Melina that said, "It's getting worse." Melina, trained to be cautious and thorough, moved with the pace her job allowed, but she moved. There was an urgency that came with the realization that the foster parent might not be simply stern, but dangerous. They were careful not to play judge. So they collected evidence. They documented every bruise with time-stamped photos. They saved messages that suggested coercion. They recorded their own witness statements about when Clive had shown up uninvited or how he had spoken to Nora. They did not take violent action. They did what their conscience permitted, gather what they could, and bring it to the people with legal authority. Melina arrived at the clubhouse a week after Nora first appeared. She wore practical shoes and held a stack of forms that smelled faintly of dust and bureaucracy. She had been in the system long enough to know where things could break, and long enough to have seen what happened when too much rested on one person's word. She listened. She took in the Polaroids. She asked Nora questions in a quiet cadence meant to make truth easier to tell. "Where did you last live? When did you last see your mother? Are you scared to go back?" Nora answered with care. She told Melina that she knew where she would be safe now. The woman's eyes softened when Nora said, "I don't want to go back to Clive." But Melina's job was not to promise a home. Her job was to make a proper determination and to escalate things to court if necessary. She filed paperwork for an emergency hearing, a formal appeal to a court that could grant temporary guardianship to someone deemed able to provide care.
It was, by necessity, a slow-moving mechanism, but there were ways to speed it up when the danger was immediate. It was at this point that the town began to take notice. Rumors can be small and poisonous, but in this case, the gossip turned into calls. Tina put up a flyer asking for anyone with knowledge to call a line. People who had seen Nora at the diner sent short notes. Someone remembered seeing Clive's van outside a school one afternoon. Another neighbor mentioned a house at the edge of town that had once been full of moving trucks and had grown quiet. The bikers did not aim to inflame. They wanted the truth. Clive reacted the way men who fear exposure do, with escalation. He started calling the clubhouse late, voice loud and slurred, threatening legal action if they did not return his child. He parked in front of the diner sometimes and stared. He used the word control like a cudgel. But he had overlooked the single thing that complicated his narrative. Nora had asked for work and found a choice. She had chosen the clubhouse because it had let her be honest about what she wanted. In small ways, that choice mattered. The hearing day was a bright and quiet morning when anxiety hangs in the air like static. The courthouse smelled like old paper and waxed floors. Nora arrived with a small backpack and Moose Joe at her side. He had taken on the task of transporting her to the hearing, not as a show of bravado, but as a practical courtesy. He had practiced his testimony in quiet with Keller and Lucky, with the honesty that was not showy, but sober. They had asked a lawyer who knew the local system to represent their case. Melina had gone through the photographs and notes and bolstered their evidence with the official weight of her records. In the hallway, Nora sat on a bench that left her knees bent like a child again, and she watched men pass with briefcases and women with heels that clicked like tiny gavel hits. She had learned to keep the outside world at bay by concentrating on small tasks, scraping a label off a can, rearranging a notepad. Those habits steadied her now. Inside the courtroom, the air felt different. An authority made visible in the judge's robes, the quick nod of clerks. There were rules, and the rules had teeth. The prosecution, in this case the state's representation through CPS, presented their evidence methodically. Photos of injuries, the Polaroid from the diner with its dated corner, the log Lucky had kept, witness statements from the men who had seen Nora's demeanor change over time. There was no dramatic outburst of a confession on Clive's part. That was not how this worked. Instead, the record spoke. The timeline suggested neglect, an inconsistency of care, and a disappearance of the mother that raised both alarm and suspicion. Clive sat stiff, arms folded, like a man trying to hold together a story that had begun to unravel. He offered denials and an insistence that Nora be returned to his care. Legal speak swirled around him. Foster placement, custodial rights, standard of care. But the judge, a woman who had seen enough to have a guarded patience, listened to the facts and weighed them against the immediacy of Nora's welfare. The critical moment came when the judge asked Nora whether she felt safe returning to the house Clive named as home. The courtroom stilled. There are times when a child's voice in a legal space carries the weight of years. Nora stood for a second and answered with a clarity that made the assembled adults shift in their chairs. "I don't want to go back," she said. "They hurt me there. Here they let me work. They didn't try to tell me I'm nothing. I choose to stay with them." That choice mattered legally and morally. It was not a matter of romanticizing the bikers as saviors. It was a matter of Nora asserting her own will in a system that sometimes forgets that children can speak truth about their safety. The judge considered the testimony and the evidence, and, seeing a plausible pattern of neglect and possible danger, granted temporary guardianship to Joe, not as an absolute forever, but as an emergency measure to ensure Nora's safety while investigations continued. The court's decision did not promise conclusion to an investigation or a criminal conviction. It did not promise that every scar would heal overnight, or that the systems that had failed Nora would be fixed. What it did promise, at least in the narrow scope of that morning, was stability, a legal recognition that someone deemed fit could care for her immediately. Moose Joe accepted the responsibility with hands that had known harder work than they had expected to carry. He signed the temporary papers, his name and address becoming, in the eyes of the court, a place of safety. Outside the courthouse, the town's gossip softened into a quieter curiosity that bordered on compassion. People who had walked a path of indifference found themselves looking at the clubhouse in a new way. Others who had scrolled past a viral post online started asking how to help. But change rarely comes from single moments. It comes from slow, stubborn accumulation. Back at the clubhouse, they prepared a room. It was not lavish. It did not need to be. It needed to be consistent. They took an extra cot up to the loft and stripped an old blanket to pieces, sewing the new one back together until it fit the bed. They put up a corkboard near the small kitchenette and pinned a list of chores, a homework sheet, and, more importantly, a drawing Nora had made of a bike with flowers tucked into the handlebars. Lucky refinished a nightstand with careful strokes. Moose Joe painted Nora's name on the old toolbox again, this time in a bright color. These were small rituals that spelled something else. Someone belonged here now, and the place would hold them. Nora kept doing the work that had first won their respect. But the work changed shape. It became not only a way to earn a place at a workbench, but a way to learn. Shepherded by Lucky, she started to understand why bolts came in different threads, and how a carburetor could be coaxed into symmetry. Keller taught her about the practicalities of community, who to trust, how to set boundaries, what it meant to keep a promise larger than a self. These were lessons that stitched into life the truth that competence breeds dignity. Yet the legal process continued in parallel. CPS investigated the disappearance of Nora's mother. Neighbors were interviewed. Clive's history with foster placements was examined like a ledger. There were days of waiting that felt like small purgatories, paperwork filed, phone calls that looped, the low hum of administrative machinery requiring patience to move. The bikers learned to be patient in a new way. They learned how to sit with uncertainty and still show up for a child who had chosen them. As weeks passed, Nora began to fill the small rituals of a life that was not just survival. She pinned homework to the fridge with magnets shaped like tiny wrenches. She started to help at the diner on weekends, sweeping the front stoop and fetching orders with a small smile. Tina, who had always had a soft corner for kids who worked for their keep, gave her a small stack of note cards with recipes scribbled on them like a secret currency. Someone bought Nora a real pair of sneakers, something with real soles, not duct tape. It felt obscene and tender at once, a new pair of shoes that did not have to be mended immediately. The town did not change overnight. The foster system did not suddenly become flawless. But the small cluster of people who surrounded Nora, the men with tattoos and tools, the diner owner with warm hands, the social worker who pressed paper like a shield, began to form a different pattern in the life of a girl who had once thought she had to accept being hurt. The clubhouse became a classroom of sorts for both mechanics and compassion. There were times when Nora's eyes would drift toward the window and trace the horizon like someone thinking of the past. She would be quiet during the night, hands in the pockets of her hoodie, and Moose Joe would notice and climb the ladder to sit beside her and hum old road songs until she relaxed. He would tell her about his mother and how she had taught him to braid rope, and how small rituals could make you feel less alone. He did not try to be a substitute parent in some grand way. He simply showed up. Keller kept up the lines with Melina. They offered the documentation they had collected, photographs in order, dates of phone calls, Tina's Polaroid. Melina used the evidence to press on the investigation of the mother's disappearance, a process that involved interviews and requests for records, and sometimes dead ends that needed lateral work. The bikers did not expect quick justice, but they had learned that persistence mattered. There were moments of genuine fear. Once, a neighbor whispered that Clive had been seen near the edge of town late at night. Lucky parked his truck in front of the clubhouse and slept in it for a night. Barker and Razor took to more visible patrols, not to menace, but to offer a presence that meant Nora would not be alone at odd hours. They called the police when they felt the line of legal action needed reinforcing. They did not take the law into their own hands. The rule was simple and sacred to them: protect the child, use the system. The line between protection and revenge is thin, and they did not cross it. Time layered itself into Nora's life. She learned to hold a wrench properly. She learned to make coffee to the exact strength that needed no sugar. She learned to say, without tears, that she did not want to go where she had been before. She learned to sleep without a knot of fear in her stomach. She learned to choose. That choice, the small sentence in a courtroom where she said she wanted to stay with them, held more than a legal consequence. It was a turning point for a child who had learned early that choices could be taken from you. The community's support gave her space to discover that some choices could be reclaimed and cherished. But there was also a broader lesson unfolding for the town. Sometimes help arrives from unexpected quarters. The bikers were not paragons of virtue. They drank and fought and sometimes said things that were blunt and clumsy. They argued about money and whose turn it was to take Nora to school. They were, in short, a family that fought and made up.
What set them apart was that when a child came asking for work, they saw a responsibility to act with a moral courage that was practical rather than performative. The case simmered in local news for a while, but the story that moved people was not about scandal so much as about the dignity of a child who asked for work and the way a ragged group pulled together to protect her. People who had once dismissed the clubhouse as a place of trouble began to see a softer edge: a small cot with a blanket, a toolbox painted with a girl's name, a corkboard that held a homework sheet and a child's drawing. Whenever someone asked Nora why she had asked to work rather than begged for money, she would look down at her hands and answer in a thin voice that suggested she had known something adult before her time. "I wanted to be useful. I wanted someone to trust me with a job." There was a humility to that sentence that made the men in the clubhouse proud in a way they did not often admit. They had not saved her in a cinematic sweep. They had given her small, daily things: food, a place to sleep, an expectation that she could do work and be treated like a person doing it. They had documented. They had called CPS. They had supported a legal process that took its time. And when the court gave Moose Joe temporary guardianship, it was because a paper trail and testimony and a judge's discretion had converged in the narrow aim of keeping Nora safe. The story did not end with a neat court decision and a clear villain behind bars. Clive's fate remained the business of investigators. The mother's disappearance became a thread that investigators pulled on cautiously. The larger issues of foster care and systemic failure did not vanish. But Nora's life had tilted in one essential direction: toward stability. There were small victories that felt tender and vital. The first time Nora made a meal for herself and Moose Joe, she cooked eggs in a skillet Lucky had reseasoned, and she smiled at the rhythm of it. She started school again, slowly, one day at a time, held by conversations with a guidance counselor who knew to sit back and let her speak. She drew a map of the garage and hung it on her wall. She accepted a library card from Keller, who had never read much but understood that books were another kind of tool. And the clubhouse began to hold more than wrenches and oil stains. It began to hold the sense that a community could be more than the sum of its flaws. People came by with donations: a coat, a pair of boots, a guitar that someone claimed Nora could learn to strum. Neighbors who had once been wary knocked on the door with casseroles.
A local teacher visited to bring a stack of used textbooks. The town's willingness to help did not solve every problem, but it made everyday life possible. At night, Nora would sometimes climb onto the porch roof, not to run away, but to sit and watch the stars and think about the strange trajectory that had brought her from tight rooms and harsh words to a place where men sang off-key and fixed old bikes in the dusk. She would lean her back against a dented oil drum and feel the hum of engines like a heartbeat in the distance. Once she said to Moose Joe, who sat beside her carving initials into a scrap of wood, "Do you think families are the people who raise you or the people who choose you?" Moose Joe didn't look up from his work. "Both," he said slowly, "but choosing is something we can do. Some people don't get to choose their first home, but you chose this one, Nora. That's important." There was a silence that felt like an answer. She pressed her hand to the toolbox with her name painted on it and let the grain of the wood speak to her. The bruise on her cheek would fade. The scars that you couldn't see, the habits of flinching, the instinct to minimize yourself, took longer, but they wore down with the steady rhythm of breakfast, of bus rides, of the small successes of learning a machine that obeyed when you treated it with care. Months later, a small-town meeting discussed the case in quieter tones. People were angry at the systems that had allowed a child to fall through the cracks. Some pledged money, some pledged time. A local policy group filed a brief asking for better oversight of certain placements. Nora did not watch every meeting. She was more interested in learning to fix a clutch than in lawyer speech. But she understood, in the slow way that people do, that a life could be improved by attention, not grand gestures, but the patient work of showing up. And the bikers, the ragged, often misapprehended crew who had become her chosen family, kept showing up. They were imperfect in all the ways that humans are, but they were consistent. When she had nightmares, someone would come get her from the loft and sit until she stopped shaking. When she needed a ride to school, someone was there. When she wanted to learn to change a tire, they walked her through it until she could do it alone. The day the judge's order was extended and then revisited and set for review, there were no trumpets. There was legal process, careful steps, and the slow, patient work of determining a child's best interest. Nora sat with Keller and Lucky during those hearings, her foot tapping the rhythm of a person whose heart had learned to keep hope like a muscle. When the judge looked at her and asked if she was being treated well, Nora's answer came clear. "Yes, I'm learning. I'm safe. I have a toolbox with my name on it." That toolbox meant something small and vast, a sign that someone expected she would work and grow and be cared for. A sign that somebody had taken the time to paint her name and set an expectation that she was not disposable. The town kept talking. Some people argued that the bikers were out of place, offering care that the system should provide. Others insisted that the real failure was the system itself that had forced a girl to walk into a clubhouse with a bruise and ask to work. The bikers, when pressed, offered a simple reply: "We do what we can." That response was both an indictment and an ethic. If you see a need and you can help, you do it without waiting for permission. As months stretched into a new routine, small rituals became anchor points. Nora pinned a scribbled schedule on the kitchen wall: school, homework, garage, chores. She left a note in Moose Joe's jacket one morning before he left for a ride: "Thanks for being here." He kept it folded in his pocket and touched it when he felt unsure. When she turned 14, there was a small celebration at the clubhouse. Not a party with clinking glasses and loud music, but a cake from Tina's diner with a candle that melted quickly in the heat of July. People who had been skeptical came by to shake hands and bring small gifts. Nora sat on the stoop and smiled without thinking about merit. She had learned to accept small kindnesses without suspicion. Years later, the case that had brought them together remained in the files of local agencies. Investigators still chased the thread of the missing mother and the legal outcomes that might or might not follow. Nora's life, however, had become a daily testimony to the truth that dignity can be restored in increments. She learned a trade, kept a steady job at the garage, and filed her own forms when she needed help. She learned the value of being trusted with small responsibilities, and eventually the power of taking responsibility herself. The final, quiet lesson of her story was not a courtroom victory or a headline. It was the ordinary accumulation of care. A toolbox with her name, a pinned homework sheet, a labeled bed. The smell of oil that no longer made her flinch, but reminded her of a place she and her people had built. She had been seen and, crucially, believed. The people who saw her were not perfect. They were rough and loud and made mistakes, but they had chosen to be better for her. On an evening that felt like a kind of homecoming, Nora sat on the bumper of an old pickup and watched a small group of children from the neighborhood tinker with a broken radio under Lucky's patient eye. She had a hand on the kid nearest to her, showing him how to thread a wire. He looked up at her with the same wary curiosity she remembered when she first came to the clubhouse. In that moment, she understood how the shape of someone's life can tilt when someone else refuses to walk away. She thought of the bruise on her face, of the hoodie, of the 2 words she had spoken at the door months ago. "Can I work here?" The question had been an act of dignity. The answer had come from a ragged band of people who chose to do the slow work of care in practical ways.
It had shaken the town, not by scandal, but by the quieter force of goodness that refused to be silent. If you watched this and felt something move in you, share it. Tell someone that small acts matter. Help a neighbor, volunteer, support child welfare services in your community. Nora's life did not become a fairy tale. There were still tough mornings, bureaucratic headaches, people who judged, and the long arc of healing. But she had a toolbox with her name on it, a bed that was hers to use, and a circle of people who showed up again and again to help her learn to hold her own life steady. The thing that had started as a single brave request at a heavy metal door rippled outward into a truth the town could not ignore. When someone asks for work, give them the chance to build it. When someone asks for help, show up with both hands. And sometimes the people who look least likely to be guardians are the ones who keep small promises the longest. If you want to help more children like Nora, check the links in the description to find local organizations supporting foster care and community outreach, and subscribe to follow stories of people who choose compassion over indifference.